In this episode, with Group Captain Shubhanshu Shukla now back home, we look at the health impacts of spending time in space and the precautions astronauts must follow when they return to Earth. We also talk about the Delhi High Court's decision to quash charges against 70 Indian nationals linked to the Tablighi Jamaat case from the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic. But we begin today by discussing the preliminary investigation report into the Boeing 787 aircraft crash. Hi, I'm Ichha Sharma, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. On the 12th of last month, the world witnessed the worst aviation disaster involving an Indian airline in at least 4 decades. A Boeing 787 Dreamliner flying from Ahmedabad to London crashed just seconds after takeoff, killing 260 people. Since then, the internet has been flooded with theories and speculations about what might have gone wrong. The situation has only been made worse by the spread of misinformation and AI-manipulated content related to the crash. Now, last week, the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau, or AAIB, which is leading the investigation, released its preliminary report on the incident. But instead of offering clarity, the report seems to have led to even more ambiguity and raised several new questions regarding the crash. To break down what the report actually says, my colleague Shashank Bhargava speaks to the Indian Express's Sukalp Sharma, who has been reporting on the crash for the paper.
Sukalp, can you tell us what a preliminary report looks at? What is supposed to be its scope?
So, Shashank, it's not a very well-defined scope, if I may say so. Because preliminary reports, usually the International Civil Aviation Organization in its guidelines says that should ideally be released within 30 days. So at that stage of the investigation, usually whatever facts are known, if any breakthroughs have been made and any other information or initial safety recommendations or other recommendations that the investigators, based on what they've found in the investigation thus far, would want to communicate.
And usually in the past, we've seen that these reports are just 4 to 5 pages long. But that's not the case this time, right?
As compared to previous preliminary reports released by the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau, this is a much more detailed report. It obviously has a similar structure, but there are more details in it.
Right, and this report is 15 pages long. And I suppose that makes sense because this is a much bigger aviation disaster than anything the AAIB has ever investigated in the past. And one of the main things that this report points to, and there has been a lot of talk about it, is the aircraft's engine control switches. Can you tell us what these switches are supposed to do and what the report says about them?
Yeah, so these are switches that are there in the cockpit. These switches, essentially, they are used to either keep fuel flowing to the engines of the aircraft or cut the fuel flowing to the engines of the aircraft. It has just 2 modes. You can either switch it from cut off to run or from run to cut off. That's about it. These are the only 2 modes. There is no in between. And these switches have a stop lock mechanism. So it's not like switching on or off a switch at your home, to switch on the lights or the fan or something. So the mechanism is such that you would need to pull out the switch a little bit to sort of disengage from the lock mechanism, and then you move it from one mode to the other between run and cut off.
And tell us, what does this report say about these switches? What do we know about what happened to them?
Okay, so the report basically says that almost immediately after the plane lifted off the ground during the takeoff procedure, fuel cutoff switches transitioned from run, which should be their state when the aircraft is airborne. They usually are always running because you can't really stop fuel supply to the aircraft even for a moment, right? So they should be running. But the report says that they transitioned from run to cutoff moments after takeoff, and they transitioned one by one with a gap of about 1 second. That's what the report says.
Okay, so they transitioned. Do we know whether this happened because the pilot or the co-pilot did something?
So that's what's being speculated a lot about right now, whether it was deliberate human action or whether it was something else, whether it was inadvertent movement. Frankly, the report does not categorically say whether the switches physically moved or not, just to be clear. It uses the word transition. And all of this is so far based on the black box data, the Enhanced Airborne Flight Recorder, the EAFR that the Boeing 787 has. It's a combined black box. So most of it, I believe at this stage, would be coming from there. Maybe some bits from the cockpit voice recorder, but we don't know for sure how much from where. But yeah, they haven't said that. But curiously enough, they've inserted one line from the cockpit voice recording. And that too is paraphrased. They haven't really put direct quotes there for reasons best known to them.
So presumably there is a bigger audio recording of the cockpit voice recorder, but they have only paraphrased one line.
One brief exchange between the pilots. This I'm reading from the report directly. So in the cockpit voice recording, one of the pilots is heard asking the other, why did he cut off? The other pilot responded that he did not do so. This is what the report says. And then the only other reference to the cockpit voice recording is about the pilot making the mayday call right at the fag end of the flight, just moments before the crash.
Okay, so like you mentioned, the report does not make things clear. We don't know whether or how these switches were moved. We don't even know who was the one asking the question in that one line that has been paraphrased. And when it comes to the switches, there is a lock mechanism. Like you said, these are not normal switches like the ones in our homes.
And it's not like if you're going for one, accidentally you'll pull both. That also can't happen. There's a gap between the switches.
Okay, so I mean, could there have been a reason why a pilot would use these switches after the flight has taken off?
So yes, there are procedures when, if in case of a dual engine flame out, both engines have lost thrust, then it's called a memory item where the pilots would switch off fuel switches, then switch them on again very quickly. It's similar to, if the tube light in the room is not working properly, we go on and off. Now it doesn't happen so much, but earlier, if you remember, when we used to have desktops at home, then when the computer would hang, then we would just press the button and then switch it back on again, reboot the thing. So it's essentially like a reboot process. That is one. The other possibility being, so let me complete this bit first because the other one has certain other procedures. So in the case of a dual engine flame out, if you're doing the switch off and on again in the hope of restarting the engines, that is something that cannot ideally, essentially the SOP is that both pilots have to consult each other and do it together. From the brief exchange that we are given in the preliminary report between the pilots, at least one of them wasn't aware of if the switches had been moved without his knowledge.
And are fuel switches something that have caused problems in the past? Do we know about that?
So the report also mentions this 2018 advisory bulletin that was issued by the US Federal Aviation Administration, which is the US regulator and the foremost aviation regulator globally. So it had said that some of the operators or airlines that had the Boeing 737 had informed that the fuel control switches were installed on some of their aircraft with the locking mechanism disengaged. So then they had issued this advisory bulletin and advising airlines, not even directing them, just advising them to maybe go ahead and just inspect the fuel switches to see if everything's all right. And the fuel switches on the 737 and the 787 and various other Boeing aircraft types are very, very similar. So that advisory bulletin was also covered the 787 aircraft.
And the report also says that the scrutiny of maintenance records revealed that the cockpit's throttle control module, which houses the fuel control switches, among other things, they were replaced in 2019 and 2023.
So the report mentions this advisory, but it also mentions Air India did not carry out those inspections because it was advisory, it was not mandatory. And before, people go and start blaming Air India, I would just say that, from whatever I've gathered from pilots of other airlines, a lot of them did not know that this sort of a thing existed, that this advisory existed, which means that Air India would not be the only airline which had not inspected it. Because, these advisories come by the truckloads. Whenever somebody points out an issue, FAA first tests and decides whether they consider this an unsafe condition or not for the aircraft. In the case of the fuel control switch disengagement, lock disengagement, they did not consider it an unsafe situation, which is also clearly mentioned in the advisory. But they still went ahead and said that, if you want, please, at leisure, whenever you want, just do a check.
And during this time, there has been a lot of questions that have been raised about the pilots and their experience, because people have been speculating about a possible human error. Could you talk a bit about the pilots who were flying this plane?
Yeah, so the pilots, one was, of course, the senior pilot, Captain Sumit Sabharwal, right? And the first officer on the aircraft, the co-pilot, was Clive Kundar. So Captain Sabharwal was a very experienced pilot. He was 56 years old, whereas Clive was a 32-year-old pilot. But he also had a substantial number of flying hours under his belt. So on the 787 specifically, Sumit Sabharwal had close to 8,600 hours of flying experience, while Clive had about over 1,100 hours. And overall, if you look at their experience, then Sumit Sabharwal had over 15,600 hours of experience on various aircraft type, while Clive was at about 3,400 hours.
And at this time, there are some pilot associations that have been raising concerns around the direction in which this investigation is headed and the narrative around it right now. So could you talk about the concerns that they have been raising?
So the pilot associations, in their view, the report, and it's not just their view, a lot of people share this view, that the report insinuates or hints at pilot action, deliberate or inadvertent. So the pilot associations are saying that it is too early in the investigation, because investigations of aircraft accidents can take months and years, because the machines are so complex. The investigation also has to be very complex. You have to go deep into all the electricals, the systems, and test out various theories. It's supposed to be a very thorough and a very systematic process, which involves a lot of time, a lot of effort. So their view is that before anything substantive has come to light, the report, the way it's written in their interpretation and the interpretation of some others from various quarters, they believe that it sort of hints at pilot error while not asking enough questions or not commenting enough about the aircraft or its maintenance or other things. But then there is the other view also that, the report is clearly hinting at something. Then there is another view that says that the report actually does not give a clean chit to anyone. The report, like we were earlier discussing, does not even say whether they moved the switches or not, or whether it was actual movement, or whether it was probably just an electrical signal that suggested to the aircraft that the switch has been moved, whereas the switch might not have been moved. There are tens. I'm sure you were also seeing all those theories being peddled. There are tens of theories doing rounds right now about what might have gone wrong with this flight.
And the other thing that stands out in this report is that it does not recommend anything to other operators of Boeing 787-8 and the GE engine that this aircraft uses. Is that also the reason people are leaning towards theories related to human error?
I believe so. That it has led to a perception that, the AIB is giving a clean chit. But to be clear, they are categorically mentioning that there are no recommended actions at this stage of the investigation. This stage of the investigation also should be seen as an operative part of the sentence and not just the fact that they have not recommended anything.
And right now, there is a lot of misinformation out there about this crash. There is a lot of AI-generated content, for example, that is fueling a lot of conspiracy theories. And this is something that experts have been warning us about. But at the same time, there have also been concerns raised about the amount of official information that has been released about the crash. So tell us a bit about that.
So the official information flow from the AAIB or from the government of India has been far from satisfactory. That's what a lot of people feel. And that creates a sort of an information vacuum, because if you don't have timely updates, then people are, of course, going to speculate. It's human nature. People are going to speculate if there are no timely clarifications, frequent media briefings, or frequent public briefings, not even if you don't want to do a media briefing, if you can just maybe twice a week come out with the facts known so far, debunk some of the unfounded, wildly speculative theories that are doing rounds. I think that would probably have gone a long way, but that hasn't really happened. Even this report, a lot of people have a problem with the fact that this report was quietly uploaded in the middle of the night between Friday and Saturday. It was past midnight. There has been no press briefing by the AAIB after the report, even to answer the genuine questions some of the experts have raised. And even after the crash, there was just one briefing by the Ministry of Civil Aviation. That was 2 days after the crash, where they essentially just encapsulated the events of the day the crash happened in terms of what happened and giving the timeline and everything, and just talking about the fact that the investigation has begun and all, but no questions were taken. And since then, we've had maybe 2, 3, or maybe maximum 4 media releases in this entire duration of over a month. So yes, a lot of people believe that the information flow could have been better, could have been more frequent, which goes a long way in letting people know the official position, the status of the investigation from time to time, and even debunk and completely sort of dismiss theories that are wildly speculative.
And now, moving on from concerns around aviation, we talk about those related to space travel. After spending 18 days on the International Space Station and orbiting Earth 288 times, Indian astronaut Group Captain Shubhanshu Shukla and his Axiom 4 crew returned home on Tuesday. Their SpaceX Dragon capsule Grace splashed down in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of California, making a milestone in India's growing role in commercial space exploration. Now, while the crew returned safely and without any immediate issues, they're not quite out of the woods yet. This transition phase, often overlooked, is actually one of the most scientifically challenging and medically delicate parts of any space mission. This period reveals just how much strain microgravity puts on the human body and shows why recovery after even short stints in space has become such a key area of focus. To understand why this reconditioning period is so crucial, we speak to the Indian Express's Anonna Dutt. Anonna, to begin with, can you explain what happens to an astronaut's body when they return to Earth after even a short mission in the space?
So the biggest impact that the astronauts face is transitioning from a microgravity environment to full gravity. So the first few steps that they take could be wobbly because they're still getting used to the living with complete gravity. And a lot of astronauts do face something known as space sickness, because there's a difference between what your brain expects to get signals from your inner ear, which is what helps us maintain our balance, and what it actually feels when someone is in microgravity. So because of this, people feel nausea, they feel dizzy when they first go to space. But also when they come back, their inner ear has to readjust to giving those signals, because they stop hearing those signals when they are in space. So listening to the inner ear again also takes some getting used to. And this happens mostly for long duration missions. There is a lot of muscle loss, there is a loss of bone density. And so when the astronauts come back to Earth, they also have a higher risk of getting injured. There's a quite high injury rate among astronauts a year after their mission. So these are some of the things that they face once they come back.
Yeah, and you write about how the post-landing medical checkup and the recovery process for these astronauts is actually considered as critical as the mission itself.
Yes. So even if you see in the case of Shubhanshu Shukla, as soon as, as the Space Dragon splashed down off the coast of California, it was picked up by a recovery vessel. And the first people to meet the crew were the medical experts, and they evaluated the astronauts. So there are certain parameters that are recorded before they go into space. So that's the baseline. And those tests are again done once they come back, just to get an idea of generally how they are doing. And any sort of rehabilitation, rest and recovery, it's all designed according to how the astronauts are feeling. And that can take from a few days in this case, because they weren't in space for very long, to even up to 45 days for long duration space flight missions.
Right. And once they are back, the real challenge begins with gravity reintroducing itself. So talk about, what specific symptoms do astronauts experience when they come back?
So the first symptoms, like I mentioned, when they experience gravity, it is hard to sort of stand up, become upright, because their balance is still getting used to. You're still, trying to get your inner ear to function the way it was when, you were on Earth. So the stepping up, walking, even doing small tasks can become very difficult for astronauts. Then I've also heard some astronauts complain about sleeping, because if you look at the space station, they sleep anywhere. They can sleep on the floor, on the wall, on the roof of the space station. So when astronauts come back, they do have a problem with, getting the right posture for sleeping, which is so much easier in a microgravity environment. There's also sometimes astronauts experience problems with their ears and eyes, but these are things that usually happen in longer duration missions. For example, the loud noises on the space station, if that affects your hearing, that is something you will carry with you even when you're on Earth. So astronauts do experience big problems with their eyesight, with their hearing as well after a stint in space.
Also, Anonna, another thing a lot of astronauts, including Scott Kelly, who spent about a year in space, have spoken about is the exposure to radiation. So could you talk about how this impacts them in the space and how it affects their body?
So in Earth, we have the atmosphere protecting us. There are several layers of atmosphere which the sun rays have to penetrate through to reach Earth. So a lot of it gets blocked by this atmosphere. We do not experience the kind of radiation that you would experience in space where there's no atmosphere. There's hardly any space dust the kind of dust, etc., that we see on Earth is not there to protect you from the radiation. So there's a much higher level of radiation that people experience in space. And like you mentioned, this experiment with Scott Kelly and his twin brother who was on Earth, there was actually evidence to show that there was some genetic changes that happened when he lived in space in this microgravity and high radiation environment for the entire duration of the mission. So that's why astronauts experience high levels of radiation and they get prone to certain diseases such as cancers. And there's also an impact on the heart health, because when you're up in space, your heart does not need to pump as hard to deliver blood to the entire body because of the microgravity. And that is why the heart muscle also can become weak after a prolonged duration of stay in space.
Right. And a lot of astronauts, we understand, quite frequently face issues in their eyes as well. Why is that?
Again, fluid in the eye, there's a change in the shape, and it happens quite frequently. It's a very common problem that astronauts face. So when they go in space, the globe of the eye, there's a change in shape, there is swelling, and it also affects the behind the eye in the retina as well. So there is a change in the structure of the eye, which is why they face a lot of vision problems. There's also a challenge that astronauts face initially when they go to space is focusing your eye. Without the gravity, it is very difficult to focus your eyes at a point. So that again is something that takes some getting used to.
Yeah, and earlier you mentioned post-flight injuries that astronauts are prone to. So could you talk a bit about which are the most common ones?
So yes, post-flight injuries, like I mentioned, it is common amongst astronauts. So you would have injuries like muscle sprain, you would have tendon-related injuries, fractures, etc., which can affect the astronauts after their flight. And it can also affect the spine. So especially when you're in a microgravity environment for a very long time, your body forgets how to bear the load of yourself because you're not using any of your muscles or bones to keep yourself upright when you're in a microgravity environment. So that also leads to a lot of muscle atrophy in the region. And that is why when you come back, it can have an effect on the spine. There can also be like herniated discs that astronauts can experience after a space flight.
And lastly, Anonna, speaking of the mission, could you talk a bit about its significance and also how it marks a new phase for India?
So Axiom 4 mission was a collaboration between the Indian Space Research Organization and the US Space Agency, NASA. And basically the mission is run by a privately owned company. And the focus was on doing a lot of microgravity research. So the 4 crew members actually carried 60 experiments with them, representing 31 countries. And this was also a mission where 3 of the countries that participated, their astronauts went to space after 4 decades. So India, Hungary, and Poland. There were 3 astronauts. Of course, India's Shubhanshu Shukla was there, but there was also a mission specialist from Poland and one from Hungary. And for these countries, there was the last space flight happened 40 years ago. For us, it was, of course, Rakesh Sharma, who went to space 41 years ago. And most importantly, this mission is basically marking a stepping stone for our own journey into space. So at the time when Rakesh Sharma went to space, of course, we did not have a space program that was even thinking of a human space mission. Now we have our own Gaganyaan mission, for which we are developing our own crew module, service module, our own human-rated launch vehicle. All of this is already happening, and a human mission is likely to take place in 2027. So the learnings that Shubhanshu Shukla and the ISRO team get through this mission would be utilized for our own Gaganyaan mission as well. So this is why it's very important for India right now.
And in the end, we talk about the Tablighi Jamaat case. Yesterday, the Delhi High Court quashed charges and ongoing proceedings against 70 Indian nationals linked to the Tablighi Jamaat case during the early phase of the COVID-19 pandemic. The decision covers 16 FIRs, where individuals were charged under multiple sections of the Indian Penal Code, including criminal conspiracy and for allegedly sheltering foreign nationals in mosques across Delhi between the 24th and the 30th of March in 2020. Now, the Tablighi Jamaat, literally meaning a society for spreading the faith, is a Sunni Islamic missionary movement. It focuses on proselytizing among ordinary Muslims, aiming to revive their faith through practices related to prayer, dress, and personal behavior. As reported by the Indian Express's Sohini Ghosh, the crime branch had filed a total of 48 charge sheets and 11 supplementary charge sheets involving 955 foreign nationals. Of these, 911 foreign nationals entered plea bargains and were eventually left out of most charge sheets. The charges also included provisions under the Epidemic Diseases Act, the Disaster Management Act, and the Foreigners Act. The case stems from a religious congregation organized by the Tablighi Jamaat at its Nizamuddin Markaz in early April 2020. Authorities alleged that the gathering violated COVID-19 restrictions and contributed to the spread of the virus. Following the incident, the Ministry of Home Affairs blacklisted over 950 foreign nationals who attended the event. Ghosh further reports that apart from the initial FIRs, 28 more were filed in other police stations across Delhi, including at Chandni Mahal, naming both Indian and foreign nationals. Some of these charges were taken cognizance of by the local magistrate courts. The High Court's decision comes more than 5 years after the event took place. While the detailed grounds for quashing are yet to be made public, the move effectively ends all criminal proceedings against the 70 Indian nationals named in these 16 FIRs. You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Shashank, Bhargava and me, Ichha Sharma. If you like the show, do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. You can also recommend it to someone you think may like it, with a friend or in your family. This is the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcast or write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.